Samskara is the fourth aggregate of attachment, defined as intentional thought. Specifically, samskara is thought that produces karmic effects. Sensations and perceptions, though mental actions, are not intentional. Thus, they do not produce karmic effects and are considered separate aggregates. The mind forms intention primarily through desire. Desire creates attachment to samsara, the suffering world, which results in rebirth. Another source of attachment comes from the false idea of the self. Having an idea of self, an everlasting, unchanging entity, can lead to dangerous thoughts such as pride and envy. All of these factors feed off of one another in an endless cycle known as pratitya samutpada. Pratitya samutpada is a Buddhist principle which states that all things and actions are conditioned by previous actions and events. Ignorance leads to desire, desire leads to samskara, samskara leads to karmic effects leads to rebirth, rebirth leads to ignorance. Lastly, meditation helps to cultivate the mind and rid it of ignorance. Developing mindfulness helps one to gain control of the mind and gain insight into impermanence. We must first clarify exactly what karma is, because there is a common misconception, especially in the West. Karma is action itself. More specifically, it is the intention behind the action. The intention is more important than the action performed. Karma is not the result or consequence of anything. The effect of an action is not karma. It is often referred to in Buddhist literature as the fruit of karma. Karma is defined as intentional action, so in essence, karma is samskara. The Buddha interpreted karma to be volition. The Buddha is quoted as saying, "O bhikshus, it is volition that I call karma. Having willed, one acts through body, speech, and mind." Thus, karma must be action that is willed to happen. Karma denotes a force or will to continue existence. To act without this intention is to be free of karma. This, however, does not mean that actions are to be performed mindlessly. Indeed, one should be mindful of every action and thought performed. An arhat, one who is free from defilements and the cycle of rebirth through the realization of nirvana, does not accumulate karma, because he is free from the desire to continue existence. One might ask, from what does nirvana result? Many might think that nirvana is the result of the extinguishing of karma. Actually, nirvana is not the result of anything. If it were a result, it would have to have come about from a cause, which would be an intentional action. As the author Walpola Rahula states, there is a path leading to the realization of nirvana, but nirvana is not the result of this path. You may get to the mountain along a path, but the mountain is not a result, not the effect of the path. You may see a light, but the light is not the result of your eyesight. By extinguishing all karma, one also extinguishes all desire to exist and continue existence. The result of desire is attachment to samsara. Samsara is often translated as the world of existence, which denotes convolution, confusion, and ignorance. In Buddhist thought, there are two types of desire: sense pleasures and existence and non-existence. Sense pleasures denote a desire for anything immediate, such as a craving for and attachment to sensual pleasure, happiness, wealth, opinions, beliefs, food, and so on. Desire for existence and non-existence is usually linked to sense pleasures. A desire to exist stems from a craving for more sense pleasures, while a desire to not exist stems from a craving to end impermanence and suffering. In order to progress along the path to nirvana, one must eliminate both forms of desire. It should be noted here that Buddhism does not discourage pleasurable experiences, only attachment to them. It is easy to initially come to the conclusion that Buddhism is a pessimistic thought tradition, but that is in fact not true. For example, love of an individual can lead to a desire to continue to be with that person, resulting in attachment and a desire to continue existence. To overcome this, rather than trying to end that feeling of love, expand the love for that individual to all living things. That way, the love is no longer an attachment, yet it is still a pleasurable experience. One difficulty that arises on the path to nirvana is that cultivating the mind and reaching nirvana are the result of desires. Before such things can be attained, the desire to attain them must be eliminated. Take, for example, the desire to buy a new car. Once you have reached the point in the process where you know that buying the car is imminent and certain, say when you are filling out the paperwork at the dealership, the desire for the car often disappears, even though you have not actually attained the car yet. Therefore, even though it might seem paradoxical at first, in order to achieve nirvana, one has to not want to achieve nirvana. The idea of the self, or Atman, is nothing more than a mental formation. This mental formation of I is nothing more than the 5 aggregates of attachment: form, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. If one looks at each of the aggregates, they find that no single one or combination of them constitutes itself, a single unchanging object or essence. The reality, according to Buddhist doctrine, is that there is no self, no thinker behind the thought, which the Buddha refers to as ANATMAN. As Buddhaghosa, a 5th century Buddhist thinker, put it, mere suffering exists, but no sufferer is found. The deeds are, but no doer is found. This is contrary to Western philosophical notions, such as those of René Descartes. A 17th century French philosopher, Descartes argued, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. According to this line of reasoning, the fact that there was a thought meant that there had to be a thinker of some sort which produced it. This is similar to Yogacara Buddhist philosophy in that consciousness is thought to exist. Indeed, the whole universe is nothing more than consciousness, but consciousness still does not constitute a self. Life and movement are one and the same. The movement occurs, but there is no entity driving the movement. There is no thinker behind the thought. The false idea of self produces hindering thoughts, such as desire, attachment, and pride. It is important to realize, however, for thoughts that involve concepts such as pride, there can actually be no pride. This is so because there is no self in which to take pride. One must realize this before nirvana can be attained. Using words such as I, me, and mine in everyday language does not necessarily constitute a belief in the self. It is simply speech conforming to the convention of the world. To totally eliminate all words which denote the existence of a self would decimate the communicative ability of human language. For all practical purposes, it makes sense to use such words, even though some might realize that they do not actually hold any truth. Furthermore, conventional truth and ultimate truth often rely on each other. In order to teach Buddhist doctrine and ultimate truth, one must start by teaching a disciple in terms of conventional truth. This is known as the practice of UPAYA. When a person has used nothing but conventional language in the past, it is almost impossible to begin learning the ultimate truths of enlightenment without a learning curve. Employing upaya means that a teacher tailors his or her message to the particular audience. It is the teacher's innate ability to discern the ultimate needs of men if they are to achieve an enlightened state. For instance, if a Buddhist teacher expounds his message to an audience of learned scholars, he can use more refined language that will lead his listeners to enlightenment quickly. If, however, he speaks to a group of illiterate peasants, he will have to use much simpler, conventional language in order for them to understand. Praticca samutpada, defined as co-originating interrelationship or conditioned genesis, is a principle laid out by the Buddha which states that everything that comes to be is the result of a prior cause. According to this principle, there can be no such thing as free will, that is, mental formations completely free of condition and the law of cause and effect. Every action, whether mental or physical, is relative to some previous action. Do not be confused into thinking that people have absolutely no say in the course of their lives. There is no supreme doer or deity who controls all action. People do determine their own actions, but their actions are conditioned and influenced, and thus not completely free. So there is free will, but not quite in the sense that Western thought has imagined it. No action is done without some kind of reason behind it. While it might be easy to picture Praticca Samutpada as a chain of events running endlessly in a single direction, it is actually best thought of as a circle. The circle begins with birth, which naturally results in ignorance. Then ignorance leads to desire, desire leads to samskara, samskara leads to karmic effects leads to rebirth, and rebirth leads back to ignorance, and so on. The circular pattern, rather than the chain, means that time did not have a beginning, and it will also not have an end. Again, if time had a beginning, it would mean that there was a cause behind its creation, which in turn means that there would have to be a doer behind the action. The same follows if time were to have an end. It would have to end as the result of a cause, which implies an action and a performer of the action. Time, according to Buddhist tradition, has always been and will always be. Meditation can be used to control mental formations that may arise. The most important and effective way to control volition is through focusing the mind, which the Buddha referred to as mindfulness. One should recognize and contemplate all actions of the mind, but should avoid correlating these actions with the false idea of the self, such as I am doing this or I am doing that. As the Buddha stated, and further bhikshus, a bhikshu lives observing the 5 aggregates of clinging as mental objects. The driving idea behind mindfulness is to self-analyze, something that is normally considered to be taboo in modern Western psychology. Instead of simply having a thought, one should look at the thought objectively without actually experiencing it. Then, one should analyze